Hi, and welcome to the BioFruitNet e-learning course, Functional Agrobiodiversity Supporting Beneficial Organisms in Fruit Production. This presentation will give you an overview of various aspects of implementing functional biodiversity in orchards, relevant for both pome and stone fruit orchards. To begin with, to know the definition and purpose of functional biodiversity will support the knowledge and competences of implementing it into the agroecosystem, here orchards. A definition of functional biodiversity states: the value, range, distribution, and relative abundance of the functional characteristics of organisms in a community. The emphasis is, among other things, on the functional characteristics of the organisms relevant for the ecological processes of the agroecosystem. The purpose in this context is to promote the diversity in functions of beneficial organisms in the agroecosystem to improve ecosystem services such as pest regulation and pollination. Natural enemies are key organisms for pest regulation and ecosystem service in orchards. The functional biodiversity measures implemented will enhance the abundance and diversity of the natural enemies, among others, predators such as ladybirds, larvae of hoverflies, lacewing and gall midges, predatory bugs, spiders and earwigs. All commonly occurring natural enemies of pests in orchards, with seasonal variation in occurrence. For example, are early season predators such as spiders of major importance to delay the first pest infestations in the orchard. Also, parasitoids, birds and bats are contributing with the natural regulation of pests in orchards. An orchard has a wide variety of organismal interactions, defining the ecological processes and the potential of pest regulation in the fruit trees. Season, location, mobility of arthropods, and semi-natural habitats are all relevant considerations when implementing functional agrobiodiversity by various methods, such as flower strips that, among other things, provide pollen and nectar, alternative prey, and habitat for natural enemies. Examples of biodiversity practices for implementation of functional agrobiodiversity in orchards are hedgerows, flower strips, cover crops, bird and bat boxes, insect boxes, tree, alley or border vegetation, and various considerations of orchard management. In the following, these examples will be addressed in more detail. Hedgerows are perennial vegetation commonly found in the edges of fruit orchards and fields. They usually have a high diversity of plants and can provide undisturbed habitat for arthropods and other organisms. The diversity in plant species and the additional cover of herbaceous plants in the hedgerow during the growth season provide natural enemies with alternative prey as well as a structural habitat. Before establishment, tree species used for the hedgerow should be considered according to region and climate, and tree species potentially hosting predominant pests and diseases should be avoided. Another option of implementing functional agrobiodiversity in orchards is flower strip. First step before establishment is to consider the species mixture. This should be as diversified as possible, optimally be a mix of herbs and grasses, for providing both structure and flower resources, and include perennial native species, for providing more long-term food and habitat resources for the natural enemies. Species that potentially promote focal pests should be avoided. Other considerations could be flowering time, to have species that flower at different times, to increase availability of pollen and nectar throughout the season. For this purpose, including flowers with different accessibility, such as open flowers for predators and closed flowers for pollinators, are optimal. Finally, having different plant heights add a more structurally diverse habitat for the natural enemies. Location of the flower strips can, for example, be in the margin of the orchard or in the orchard replacing a row of apples or in the tree alleyways. An important aspect to consider as well is the distance to the flower strip, as the efficiency of the natural pest control has shown to decrease with distance to flower strip. Depending on the region, there are different optimal times for sowing the flower strip, one in spring and one in late summer or autumn. The most common type of cover crops in orchards are grasses or grass mixtures. The functional agrobiodiversity can be increased by diversifying the cover crop mixtures, hereby providing resources for natural enemies. The cover crop can also be of economical value in the case where the cover crop is a marketable product. When implementing bird and bat boxes and insect boxes in the orchard, their occurrence and diversity is promoted. All of these organisms can contribute to the natural pest control, and the implementation is only minor time-consuming, and thereby a simple method of increasing the functional agrobiodiversity in the orchard. With the same purpose of other plant-diverse vegetational structures implemented in the orchard, such as hedgerows, flower strips, and cover crops, tree alley vegetation and border vegetation can as well increase the functional agrobiodiversity. This can, for example, be done by leaving spontaneous flora and naturally occurring weeds and managing these by alternate cuttings, always leaving flowering vegetation as an available resource for natural enemies. Another option is intercropping in the tree alleyways, for example by growing peas, herbs, and similar. Timing of cutting and practicing alternate cuttings of the various types of vegetation can maintain their diversification. Anchor plants, which can for example be single bushes or trees, can be placed in the end of tree rows. And pruning, irrigation, and soil management should be carefully considered, as it can impact arthropods. Finally, orchard design, considering for example diversity of cultivars, tree species, agroforestry, and location of agroecological structures are key factors for maintaining the functional agrobiodiversity and increase the natural regulation of pests in the orchard. There are a number of potential barriers of implementation. First of all, the pest regulation by the natural enemies is not immediate by these methods, but long-term, and will increase with time. It can, depending on which and where it is implemented, take area from production, as well as increase costs. In general, it requires to learn new management practices for optimal effect. And management dependent, it requires knowledge to minimize the risk of voles and spreading of weeds. Finally, competition between orchard trees and implemented trees and plants should be taken into consideration. Implementing functional agrobiodiversity and adapting the management accordingly can potentially provide an efficient natural regulation of pests in orchards. This concludes the BioFruitNet e-learning module on functional agrobiodiversity, supporting beneficial organisms in fruit production. Thanks for your attention.